The rain was coming down in that gray, relentless way it only does in Seattle in late October, blurring the neon signs of the suburban strip malls into smears of sickly yellow and red. I was sitting in my truck, the engine idling, staring at the front door of my own house. It's funny how you can live somewhere for 8 years, pay the mortgage, mow the lawn, and know every squeak in the floorboards, but suddenly feel like a total stranger looking in from the outside. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, and my heart was doing this weird, erratic thumping against my ribs. I hadn't even turned the headlights off yet. I just sat there, watching the flickering light of the television through the living room curtains. My name is Mark, and 3 years ago I thought I had the kind of life people envied. I had a solid job as a project manager for a construction firm, a cozy 3-bedroom house in a quiet cul-de-sac, and a wife, Sarah, who was the kind of woman who made people stop and look when she walked into a room. She was smart, a high-level marketing executive, and we'd been together since our junior year at the University of Washington. We were the golden couple, or at least that's what everyone told us at Thanksgiving dinner every year. But as I sat in that truck, everything felt like it was made of glass that had already started to crack, and I was just waiting for the sound of it finally shattering. It all started when Jason moved in. Jason had been my best friend since we were kids, playing Little League together. He was the guy who stood next to me at my wedding, the guy I'd bailed out of trouble more times than I could count. He'd hit a rough patch, a messy divorce followed by a series of bad investments that left him basically broke and crashing at a cheap motel on the edge of town. When he called me, sounding smaller and more defeated than I'd ever heard him, I didn't even hesitate. I didn't even talk to Sarah first, which was my first mistake. I just told him to pack his bags and that our guest room was his for as long as he needed it. Sarah hadn't been thrilled at first. She liked her privacy, her routines, her Sunday mornings in her robe drinking expensive coffee in silence. But Jason was charming. He was the kind of guy who knew how to make himself useful. He'd fix the leaky faucet before I even noticed it. He'd grill steaks on Friday nights. And he had this way of making Sarah laugh that I realized, with a sting of guilt, I hadn't done in a long time. Work had been a grind for both of us. We were tired. We were comfortable, which is often just a polite word for bored. Jason brought a different energy into the house. He was the spark that we didn't know we were missing. For 6 months, it worked. Better than I expected, actually. We were like a little family unit. We'd watch movies together, go on hikes on the weekends, and have long dinners where we'd talk about everything and nothing. I felt good about myself. I was the good guy, helping out a brother in need. I didn't see the shifts. I didn't notice how Sarah started dressing up a little more for dinner, or how Jason would linger in the kitchen just a bit longer when I went upstairs to check my emails. I didn't see the way their eyes would meet over the table and hold for a fraction of a second too long. I was blind, or maybe I was just arrogant enough to think that my life was untouchable. Then came that Tuesday night. I was supposed to be in Portland for a 2-day conference. I told Sarah I wouldn't be back until Thursday afternoon, but the keynote speaker got sick. The whole event turned into a disorganized mess, and by 4 p.m., I decided I'd rather drive 3 hours in the rain than spend another night in a lonely hotel room eating club sandwiches. I didn't call her. I wanted to surprise her. I thought maybe we'd go out to that Italian place she liked, just the two of us, and finally have a real conversation. I pulled into the driveway around 8 p.m. The house was quiet, except for the TV. I walked up to the front door, my key already in my hand, but I paused. Something felt off. The air felt heavy, like the atmosphere right before a massive thunderstorm. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could, stepping into the entryway. The house smelled like Sarah's perfume and wood smoke from the fireplace. I dropped my bag softly on the rug and walked toward the living room, a smile already forming on my face, ready to see the look of surprise on her face. But she wasn't in the living room. Jason wasn't there either. The TV was just playing some random sitcom to an empty couch. I frowned, moving toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. That's when I heard it. A muffled sound, a thud, followed by a sharp, pained intake of breath. My heart stopped. My first thought wasn't betrayal, it was danger. I thought maybe someone had broken in. I thought maybe Jason and Sarah were being hurt. I lunged toward our master bedroom. The door cracked open just an inch, a sliver of warm light spilling out onto the carpet. I pushed the door open, my mouth open to yell, to defend, to do something.
but the words died in my throat. The scene before me wasn't a robbery, it was a nightmare. Sarah was on the floor, huddled near the foot of the bed, her hand clutching her side. Her face was flushed, her hair a mess, and there was a dark, blossoming bruise already forming on her cheekbone. And standing over her, his chest heaving, his face contorted into something I didn't recognize, was Jason. He wasn't the friend I grew up with. He looked like a monster. "I told you to shut up about him," Jason hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "He's not here. He doesn't matter. You're with me now."
Sarah let out a sob, a broken, jagged sound that tore through me. "Jason, stop, please. Mark is going to be home in 2 days. You have to leave. This has gone too far." "Mark isn't coming back for you," Jason screamed. And before I could even process the words, he swung. It wasn't a slap. It was a closed fist punch that caught her right in the temple. Sarah's head snapped back, hitting the wooden bed frame with a sickening crack, and she went limp. She didn't even scream this time. She just slumped onto the floor like a broken doll. I didn't think. I didn't feel. I just moved. I was across the room in 2 strides. I didn't use words. I tackled Jason with every ounce of weight and rage I had in my body. We hit the wall, a framed picture of our wedding day shattering as we went down. I was hitting him over and over, my fists connecting with his jaw, his nose, his chest. I wanted to kill him. I truly, honestly wanted to end his life right there on my bedroom floor. He fought back, clawing at my eyes, but I was possessed. It took everything in me not to pick up the heavy lamp on the nightstand and cave his skull in. Finally, he scrambled away, bleeding from his nose and mouth, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated malice. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't explain. He just looked at me with this twisted, hateful grin. "You're too late, Mark," he spat, wiping blood on his sleeve. "You are always too late." He bolted out of the room, and I heard the front door slam a few seconds later. I didn't chase him. I couldn't. I turned to Sarah. She was white as a sheet, her breathing shallow and ragged. There was blood coming from the back of her head where she'd hit the bed. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped it twice. I dialed 911, my voice cracking as I gave them our address. "Please," I whispered, kneeling beside her, reaching out to touch her hand, but afraid I'd break her further. "Sarah, please wake up. Please stay with me." The ambulance arrived 10 minutes later, but it felt like hours. The paramedics were efficient, professional, moving with a speed that terrified me. They loaded her onto a gurney, her neck in a brace, tubes and wires suddenly everywhere. I followed them out into the rain, my shirt soaked, my mind a blur of static. One of the officers stayed behind to take a statement, but I couldn't even look at him. I just kept staring at the blood on the carpet, the blood that belonged to the woman I loved, spilled by the man I called a brother. I followed the ambulance to the hospital, driving like a madman. I sat in the waiting room for 4 hours, the fluorescent lights humming above me, the smell of antiseptic making me nauseous. Every time a doctor walked through the double doors, my heart stopped. Finally, a man in blue scrubs, a Dr. Eris, walked toward me. He looked tired, his eyes heavy with the weight of things he'd seen that night. "Mr. Miller?" he asked. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. "Your wife is stable. She has a severe concussion, 2 broken ribs, and we're monitoring her for internal bleeding. She's lucky. If that blow to the head had been an inch higher..." He trailed off, shaking his head. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "Can I see her?" "Not yet," he said, stepping closer to me. He looked around to make sure no one was listening, his expression shifting from professional to something more guarded, more personal. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Miller, while we were running the scans and doing the intake, there's something you need to know, something that isn't in the official police report yet. I think you should hear it from me before you talk to the detectives again." My stomach dropped. I thought about the affair. I thought about the betrayal I'd just witnessed. I thought I knew the worst of it. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. The doctor leaned in closer, his breath smelling like stale coffee. "We did a routine blood panel and a pelvic exam because of the nature of the assault. Mr. Miller, your wife is 9 weeks pregnant. But based on the blood type compatibility and some specific markers we found, there is no biological way that child is yours." The world tilted. The hospital sounds faded into a dull roar. I stared at the doctor, his words echoing in my skull like a death sentence. 9 weeks. 2 months. 2 months of Jason living in my house. 2 months of me thinking I was being a good friend. 2 months of a life that was a lie. I sat back down in the hard plastic chair, the weight of the universe crushing me. My wife was in a hospital bed, beaten and broken by her lover, carrying a child that wasn't mine. And the worst part? I realized in that moment that the nightmare was only just beginning. The silence in that hospital waiting room was louder than any scream. I sat there, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor, trying to do the math. 9 weeks. 9 weeks ago, we had gone to that street fair downtown. We'd shared a funnel cake, laughed at the overpriced local art, and I'd held her hand as the sun went down over the Puget Sound, thinking how lucky I was. All that time, she'd already been carrying a secret. She'd been carrying him. The man sleeping in the room next to ours, the man who ate at our table and drank my beer and called me his brother. The betrayal didn't just feel like a stab in the back. It felt like I was being erased, like my entire history with Sarah was being rewritten into something cheap and ugly. Dr. Aris stayed with me for a moment longer, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. It was a gesture of pity, and I hated it. I didn't want pity. I wanted to wake up. I wanted to go back to that morning and never leave for Portland. I wanted to go back 3 years and never answer Jason's phone call. But the world doesn't give you rewinds. It just keeps grinding forward, indifferent to the fact that your soul is being shredded. The doctor eventually moved on, called away by a paging beep, leaving me alone with the ghost of my marriage. I must have sat there for another hour before a detective arrived. His name was Miller, same as mine, ironically, a thick-necked guy with a weary face and a suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders. He sat down in the chair next to me, clicking a ballpoint pen. He didn't start with the pregnancy. He started with the assault. I told him what I saw, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else, someone far away. I described the punch, the way Sarah hit the bed frame, the look on Jason's face. I told him about the months Jason had spent in our house. "Did you have any suspicion they were involved?" the detective asked, his eyes sharp despite his tired appearance. "No," I lied. Or maybe it wasn't a lie. I'd had suspicions, but I'd buried them under the floorboards of my mind because the truth was too heavy to carry. I trusted them, both of them. "We've put out a bolo on his vehicle," Miller said. "He's a person of interest in a felony domestic assault now. If he's got any sense, he's halfway to the border. But guys like this usually go to ground somewhere familiar. You have any idea where he'd go?" I thought about Jason's old haunts, the dive bars on the outskirts of Tacoma, the basement apartments of the sketchy broads he used to date. I gave the detective a few names, a few places, but my heart wasn't in it. Part of me wanted the police to find him, but a darker, more primitive part of me wanted to find him first. I wanted to feel his ribs give way under my boots. I wanted to see the light go out of his eyes. It was a terrifying feeling, a cold, black tide of rage that felt completely alien to the man I thought I was. Eventually, they let me go into the ICU to see her. The room was dark, lit only by the glowing monitors and the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds. Sarah looked so small in that bed. The bruising had darkened, a deep, angry purple that covered the left side of her face. Her lip was split, and her arm in a soft cast. She looked like a car crash victim. I stood at the foot of the bed, my hand shoved deep into my pockets so I wouldn't reach out to her. The love was still there, flickering like a dying candle, but it was being choked out by the image of her and Jason together. Her eyes flickered open. She squinted against the dim light, her gaze drifting around the room until it landed on me. She tried to speak, but her voice was a dry rasp. "Mark?" "I'm here," I said. My voice was flat. No warmth, no comfort, just a statement of fact. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, a tear tracking through the dried blood on her cheek. "Mark, he just snapped. I tried to tell him it was over. I tried to tell him I wanted my life back. I wanted us back. I walked closer, leaning over the bed rail. I could smell the hospital on her, the iodine, the soap, the metallic tang of blood. Which part are you sorry for, Sarah? The part where he hit you, or the part where you spent the last 2 months letting my best friend into our bed while I was at work? She froze. The monitors next to her bed began to beep faster as her heart rate climbed. She looked away, her jaw trembling. How did you... The doctor, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. He told me about the baby, Sarah. He told me it isn't mine. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Sarah started to sob, a jagged, ugly sound that shook her entire frame. She didn't deny it. She didn't offer an excuse. She just cried. And as I watched her, I realized that I didn't feel the urge to comfort her. I didn't want to hold her and tell her it would be okay. I felt a cold, clinical detachment. This woman wasn't my wife anymore. She was a stranger who happened to be wearing my wife's face. He told me he loved me. She managed to choke out between sobs. He told me you didn't see me anymore, that you were just going through the motions. And I was lonely, Mark. I was so lonely. It just happened. One night when you were working late, we were having wine, and it just happened.
It doesn't just happen for 9 weeks, Sarah, I snapped. You made a choice every single day. Every time you kissed me goodbye, every time you sat across from me at dinner, you were choosing him. You brought a predator into our home, and you gave him the keys to our life. And look what he did with them. He wasn't like that before, she pleaded, reaching out a trembling hand toward mine. I stepped back, out of her reach. The pregnancy, it changed him. He became possessive. He started talking about us running away, about him being the father he never had. When I told him I wouldn't leave you, that I'd have an abortion if I had to, that's when he lost it. He said if he couldn't have me, he'd make sure I was too broken for you to want. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a psychological war zone. Jason hadn't just wanted my wife, he wanted to dismantle my entire existence. He wanted to take my home, my future, and leave me with the wreckage. He had played me for a fool from the very first phone call. He probably laughed every time I bought him a meal or offered him a place to stay. Where is he, Sarah? I asked, my voice calm now, which was somehow scarier than the shouting. I don't know, she cried. Please, Mark, don't do anything crazy. Just call the police. Let them handle it. The police are already looking for him, I said, turning toward the door. But they're looking for a criminal. I'm looking for a ghost. I walked out of the room without looking back. I ignored the nurses, ignored the security guard at the desk, and walked straight out into the cold night air. The rain had stopped, leaving the world shimmering and dark. I got into my truck and sat there for a long time, the engine cold. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a rag. It was a 9mm I kept for home defense. I'd never had to use it. I'd never even fired it outside of a range. I checked the magazine. Full. I slid it back into the grip with a satisfying click. My mind was racing. Jason didn't have money, and his car was a junker that wouldn't get him far. He'd need a place to hide, somewhere off the grid but close enough to keep an eye on things. He was obsessed with Sarah. She'd said it herself. He wouldn't just disappear. He'd be watching. He'd be waiting to see if his handiwork had finished the job of destroying us. I started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot, but I didn't go home. I couldn't go home. Every corner of that house was tainted now. Instead, I drove toward the industrial district, toward an old warehouse where Jason used to work as a night watchman years ago. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had that the police wouldn't think of. I knew he still had a key to the side gate. He'd bragged about it once, saying it was the perfect place to go if things ever went south. As I drove, I thought about the life I'd lost. I thought about the nursery we were going to paint. I thought about the retirement we'd planned. It was all gone, burned to ash by a man I treated like a brother and a woman I'd given my heart to. I felt a strange sense of clarity. The grief was there, but it was underneath the rage, fueling it, turning it into something sharp and focused.
I reached the warehouse district around 3 a.m. The area was a wasteland of rusted corrugated metal and cracked asphalt. I turned off my lights a block away and coasted to a stop. I stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at my skin, and tucked the gun into the small of my back. The silence of the night was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the freeway. I walked toward the side gate of the warehouse, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I saw it. Tucked behind a stack of rotting pallets, barely visible in the shadows, was Jason's beat-up old sedan. The hood was still warm. He was here. The warehouse loomed over me like a tomb, its corrugated metal skin rattling in the wind. I stood there for a moment, the cold metal of the pistol pressing against my spine, feeling the weight of every choice that had led me to this desolate edge of the city. I looked at Jason's car, a rusted-out hunk of junk that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation, and I felt a flicker of disgust. This was the man Sarah had traded our life for. This was the man she had allowed to sleep in the next room while I dreamed of our future. I stepped toward the side entrance, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar, just enough to let a sliver of darkness leak out into the night. I slipped inside, the air hitting me with the smell of damp concrete and old engine oil. It was pitch black, except for the faint, hazy glow of a single security light high in the rafters. My eyes adjusted slowly, pulling shapes out of the gloom. Stacks of wooden crates, rusted machinery, and long, jagged shadows that looked like reaching fingers. I kept my back to the wall, moving with a silence I didn't know I possessed. Every drop of water hitting a puddle sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. I could feel the adrenaline humming in my veins, a cold electric current that sharpened my senses and numbed my fear. I heard it then, a low, rhythmic scraping sound coming from the back of the building, near the old foreman's office. It was the sound of someone moving furniture, or maybe just pacing. I reached behind me and drew the 9mm, the weight of it grounding me. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a speech prepared. I just had a hole in my chest where my life used to be, and I wanted to fill it with justice, or vengeance, or whatever the hell you call it when you've lost everything. As I got closer to the office, a pale light flickered from under the door. I heard a voice, low, jagged, and familiar. Jason was talking to himself. I leaned my head against the cold wall, listening.
"Stupid," he hissed. "So damn stupid. You should have just waited. She would have come around. She was already half gone anyway." I felt a surge of heat crawl up my neck. He wasn't mourning the fact that he'd nearly killed her. He wasn't reeling from the betrayal of a lifelong friendship. He was mourning his own botched timing. He was annoyed that his conquest hadn't gone according to plan. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. I thought about Sarah's face in that hospital bed, the way her skin hip looked like bruised fruit, and the last of my hesitation evaporated. I kicked the door open. The wood splintered against the frame with a violent crack. Jason spun around, dropping a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey that shattered across the floor. He was sitting on an old, tattered armchair, a duffel bag half-packed on the desk next to him. He looked pathetic, his eyes bloodshot, his lips swollen from where he'd hit him earlier, his hands shaking. But when he saw me, and when he saw the gun, he didn't look scared. He looked annoyed. "Mark," he said, leaning back as if we were just catching up at a bar. "I figured you'd be at the hospital playing the grieving husband. You always were a bit too predictable." "Shut up," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. I raised the gun, the sight centering right on his chest. "Get up. Get on your knees." He didn't move. He just stared at me, a slow, mocking smile spreading across his face. "You aren't going to pull that trigger, man."
"We've known each other since we were 5. You cried when I accidentally killed a toad with a lawnmower in 2nd grade. You don't have that in you." "That Mark died about 4 hours ago," I said, stepping into the room. The smell of whiskey and sweat was overpowering. "The Mark that's standing here just watched a doctor explain why his wife is carrying your child while she lies in an ICU. That Mark is gone, Jason." Jason's smile faltered for a fraction of a second when I mentioned the baby, but then it returned,
sharper and more vicious. The baby, right. I guess the cat's out of the bag then. You know, I actually did you a favor. You were never enough for her. You were the safe choice, the boring suburban dream she thought she wanted. But she was dying of boredom with you, Mark. Every night you stayed late at the office, she was in my arms telling me how much she hated the life you built for her. You're lying, I whispered, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. Am I? Jason laughed, a dry, hacking sound. Ask her about the weekends you were on site in Olympia. Ask her who she was really thinking about when she closed her eyes. I didn't have to force her, Mark. I just had to show up. She was looking for an exit, and I was the nearest door. I felt the gun shaking in my hand. I wanted to pull the trigger so badly it was an actual physical ache in my finger. I wanted to erase that smug, hollow look from his face.
But as I looked at him, truly looked at him in the harsh light of that office, I saw the desperation underneath the bravado. He was a parasite. He had spent his whole life taking things from people who actually worked, who actually cared, and he'd finally taken the one thing that mattered to me. If I killed him, I was just letting him take my soul, too. I'd be the one in a cage while he was finally at peace. You're not worth the paperwork, I said, my voice steadying. I lowered the gun just a few inches, but I didn't put it away. The police are on their way, Jason. I called them before I came in. They'll be here in 5 minutes. You've got a choice. You can sit there and wait for them to haul you away for felony assault, or you can try to run and see if I change my mind about that trigger. Jason's face darkened. He looked at the duffel bag, then back at me. You think you won? Even if I go to prison, you're the one who has to go back to that house. You're the one who has to look at her and see me. Every time she looks at that kid, she's going to see my eyes. You're haunted, Mark, for the rest of your life. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because he was right. Even if he disappeared forever, the damage was structural. He had cracked the foundation of my world, and there was no way to patch. Suddenly, the distance was faint, rising wail of sirens. Jason's eyes widened. He hadn't thought I'd actually called them.
He thought this was a personal showdown, a chance for him to manipulate me one last time. He lunged for the duffel bag, but I stepped forward and shoved him back into the chair. Stay down, I growled. Mark, come on, he pleaded, his voice shifting back into that best friend tone that made my skin crawl. Don't do this. Give me a head start, for old time's sake. We're brothers, man. My brother died a long time ago, I said. The blue and red lights began to flash against the dirty windows of the warehouse, cutting through the dark and rhythmic pulses. I backed out of the room, keeping the gun trained on him until I reached the hallway. I didn't want to be there when they took him. I didn't want to see the handcuffs. I didn't want the closure of a trial or a sentencing. I just wanted to be away from him. I walked back out into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I tucked the gun back into its hiding spot and walked toward the line of police cruisers screaming into the lot. I held my hands up, palms open, letting the light wash over me. I felt empty. Not relieved, not satisfied, just completely and utterly empty. As the officers swarmed past me, guns drawn, shouting orders, I kept walking until I reached my truck. I sat inside and watched the chaos. 10 minutes later, they led Jason out in zip ties. He was shouting, cursing my name, kicking at the shins of the officers. He looked small. He looked like the nothing he had always been. I drove away before the detectives could try to talk to me again. I drove aimlessly for hours, watching the city wake up around me. People were starting their commutes, grabbing coffee, oblivious to the fact that worlds were ending in the shadows of their streets. I ended up back at the hospital, sitting in the same parking spot I'd left hours before. I went back up to the ICU. The nurses looked at me with those sympathetic eyes again, but I ignored them. I walked into Sarah's room. She was awake now, staring out the window at the gray morning sky. She turned her head when I walked in, her eyes searching mine for some sign of the man I used to be. Is he gone? She asked. He's in custody, I said. I sat in the chair beside her bed, but I didn't get too close. It's over, Sarah. What happens now? She whispered, her voice trembling. What happens to us? I looked at her, at the bruise on her face that was a permanent reminder of the man she'd chosen over me. I thought about the secret she was carrying, the life that was growing inside her,
a life that was half of my worst enemy. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. "There is no us, Sarah," I said quietly. "There's just the fallout." She started to cry again, but I didn't feel the sting this time. I felt like I was watching a movie in a language I didn't speak anymore. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wedding ring. It felt light in my hand, a piece of cheap gold that had lost all its magic. I set it on the rolling bedside table next to a cup of lukewarm water. "I'm going to help you get through the recovery," I said, my voice firm. "I'll pay the bills, I'll make sure the lawyers are handled. But when you walk out of this hospital, you aren't coming home. I've already started the process. The house is going on the market on Friday." "Mark, please," she begged. "Don't give up on me. I made a mistake, a horrible, life-destroying mistake, but I love you. I've always loved you." "You don't do this to people you love," I said, standing up. "You don't bring a wolf into the house and act surprised when he starts biting. You chose this, Sarah. Now you have to live with the person you became when you thought I wasn't looking." I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, a nurse I hadn't seen before stepped in. She looked flustered, holding a folder in her hand. She looked at me, then at Sarah, then back at the folder. "Mr. Miller?" she asked. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Aris asked me to bring these updated labs to you. There was a clerical error in the initial intake from the night shift." My heart did a strange, painful stutter. I looked at the folder. "What kind of error?" The nurse looked down at the paper, her brow furrowed. "The blood type compatibility they used for the initial assessment, it was based on a different patient's chart that got flagged in the system."
We've just finished the confirmatory DNA sequencing from the prenatal screen. She paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mr. Miller, the child Sarah is carrying, the markers are a perfect match. You are the biological father." The nurse's words hung in the air like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, until the only things that existed were Sarah's wide, tear-filled eyes and the white piece of paper the nurse was holding. I felt a cold chill wash over me, a numbness that started at my toes and raced up to my chest. I looked at the wedding ring I had just placed on the table. It sat there, a small circle of gold reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights, mocking me. I had been so sure. I had built a fortress of rage to protect myself from the pain, and now the foundation was being ripped out from under me once again. "What?" I whispered, the word barely catching in my throat. "Are you sure?" The nurse nodded, her expression softening into that professional brand of empathy that usually made my skin crawl, but right now it felt like a lifeline. "The initial screening was done in haste during the trauma intake. Errors like that are rare, but when the system is overwhelmed at 2 a.m., they happen. The DNA sequencing we ran this morning is definitive, Mr. Miller. There is no doubt. The baby is yours." I looked back at Sarah. She was staring at me, her mouth slightly open, a fresh wave of tears spilling over the bridge of her nose. The silence in the room was deafening. Every accusation I had hurled at her, every cold word, every bit of the detachment I had cultivated over the last 12 hours, it all felt like it was curdling in my stomach. She was still a woman who had betrayed me. She had still let another man into our home, into our lives, and into her bed. But the child, the one thing I thought was the ultimate evidence of her betrayal, was mine. It was the dream we had talked about for years, finally manifesting in the middle of a nightmare. The nurse sensed the tension and quietly stepped out, closing the heavy door behind her. I stood there, paralyzed. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drop to my knees and beg for forgiveness, and in the same breath, I wanted to demand she explain how she could let things get this far. "Mark," Sarah said, her voice a broken reed. "Mark, I didn't know. I swear to God, I thought because of how things were with Jason, I thought it had to be his. I was so scared. I felt so guilty that I just assumed the worst." "You still did it, Sarah," I said, my voice cracking. I walked back to the bedside, but I didn't pick up the ring. "You still brought him into our house. You still slept with him. Whether the baby is mine or his doesn't change the fact that you destroyed my trust. It doesn't change the fact that my best friend nearly killed you in our bedroom." "I know," she sobbed, reaching out to grab the edge of my sleeve. I know I don't deserve you. I know I've ruined everything. But this baby, our baby, it's a chance, isn't it? It's the only good thing left." I looked down at her hand, the skin pale and bruised. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions that threatened to tear me apart. I loved her. God help me, I still loved her. But the woman I loved wouldn't have done this. The woman I loved was a memory, a ghost of the person lying in this bed. And yet, there was a life involved now, a life that was part of me, a life that would need a father, a home, and a future that wasn't built on a foundation of lies and blood. I sat down in the chair, burying my face in my hands. I thought about the warehouse. I thought about the gun in my truck and the look on Jason's face when the police took him away. He was gone, likely heading for a long stretch in a state penitentiary for what he'd done. He wouldn't be a shadow over us anymore, at least not physically. But the mental shadow, that was different. Every time I looked at Sarah, I would see him. Every time I walked into our bedroom, I would see the shattered glass and the blood on the carpet. "I can't go back to that house, Sarah," I said, finally looking up. My eyes were burning. "I can't live in a place where that happened. I meant what I said. The house is being sold." She nodded frantically.
"I don't care about the house. We can go anywhere. We can start over. I'll do anything, Mark. I'll go to therapy. I'll give you every password to every account I have. I'll quit my job if I have to. Just don't leave me alone with this." I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the city. The sun was fully up now, lighting up the skyscrapers of Seattle in a pale, cold gold. The world was moving on. People were going to work, making plans, living lives that didn't involve felony assaults and paternity shocks. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a great canyon, and I had to decide whether to jump or try to build a bridge. "We aren't starting over," I said, my voice cold and hard. "You don't start over after something like this. You survive it, or you don't." I picked up the wedding ring from the table. I held it between my thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight. I didn't put it back on. Instead, I dropped it into my pocket. "I'm going to take you home when you're discharged," I continued, "but not to our house. I'm booking an extended stay rental near the waterfront. We're going to live there while the house sells. We're going to talk to lawyers, and we're going to talk to doctors. And when this baby is born, we'll see what's left of us." "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes closing in relief. "Thank you, Mark." "Don't thank me," I said, standing up to leave. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for the kid."
Because he shouldn't have to pay for the fact that his mother is a liar and his father's best friend is a sociopath. I walked out of the room before she could say another word. I needed air. I needed to be away from the smell of hospital soap and the sound of her crying. I walked down to the cafeteria and bought a coffee I didn't want, sitting at a small table in the corner. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from the detective, Miller. "Jason's being processed. He's asking for a lawyer, but he's already made enough statements to bury himself. We found a stash of your wife's jewelry in his bag, along with some of your personal documents. Looks like he was planning a full identity theft before things went south. Give me a call when you can." I stared at the screen. Jason hadn't just wanted Sarah. He had been planning to become me. He wanted my life, my name, my credit, my everything. He was a parasite who had almost finished devouring his host. I felt a strange sense of vindication, but it was hollow. He was in a cell, and I was in a cafeteria, and we were both sitting in the wreckage of a life. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and silence. We moved into a 2-bedroom suite overlooking the gray waters of the Sound. It was modern, sterile, and completely devoid of any memories. It was perfect. Sarah spent most of her time on the couch, her body slowly healing, her eyes always following me whenever I moved through the room. I was a ghost in my own life. I worked from my laptop. I cooked meals in total silence, and I slept on the sofa in the living room. We didn't talk about that night. We didn't talk about Jason. We spoke in logistics, doctor's appointments, real estate listings, insurance claims. It was a fragile, miserable peace. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. Every time there was a knock at the door, I felt my hand instinctively reach for a weapon that wasn't there. One night, about a month after the hospital, I was standing on the small balcony, watching the ferry boats cross the dark water. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and rain. Sarah came out and stood a few feet away from me, wrapping a thick cardigan around her swelling stomach. She looked better. The bruises were gone, replaced by a pale, haunted look that I suspected would never truly leave her. "The house sold today," I said, not looking at her. "The closing is in 3 weeks. After the debts are cleared, there's a decent amount of equity. Half is yours. I've set up a separate account for you." "Mark, I don't want the money," she said softly. "Take it anyway," I replied. "You're going to need it. Because when this baby is born, I'm filing for divorce." She didn't cry this time. She just leaned against the railing, her shoulders sagging. I knew it was coming. I hoped maybe if I was perfect, if I showed you I could be the woman you married again. "That woman is dead, Sarah," I said, finally turning to look at her.
"She died the second you let him touch you. I've spent every night for the last month trying to find a way to look at you and not see him. I've tried to find a way to hear your voice and not hear the things he said you told him. But I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that bedroom. I'm watching him hit you, and I'm realizing that the only reason I was there to save you was because I was lucky." I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "I'll be there for the birth. I'll be a father to this child. I'll give him everything I have. But I can't be your husband. I can't live a lie just because it's easier than being alone." Sarah looked out at the water, a single tear tracking down her face. "I understand." "Do you?" I asked. "Because I don't. I don't think I'll ever understand how we got here." I left her on the balcony and went inside. I picked up my jacket and my keys. I needed to drive. I needed to feel the road beneath me, moving toward a destination I hadn't picked yet. As I walked toward the door, I passed a mirror in the hallway. I stopped and looked at myself. I looked older. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there in the summer. My hair was grayer at the temples. I looked like a man who had survived a war, only to find out there was nothing left to come home to. But then, I thought about the ultrasound photo tucked into my wallet. A tiny, flickering heartbeat. A new life that didn't know about betrayal or warehouses or blood on the carpet. A life that was mine. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut. The lock clicked into place with a final, heavy sound. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't know if I'd ever feel whole again. But as I walked toward the elevator, I realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't looking behind me. I was just walking. The story was over, but my life was just starting to begin again, piece by painful piece. Do you want me to generate the next part?